Hello and welcome back to the Alnwick Castle Podcast. I'm Daniel Watkins.
And I'm Deborah Beecroft.
And on today's episode, we're marking the anniversary of William Shakespeare's birth with a returning guest.
Last year, we were joined by Ronan Paterson to talk about Shakespeare's connections to Alnwick Castle and the Percy family. You can still hear that conversation by listening to episode 8 of the podcast.
And this year, Ronan's back to talk us through the Shakespeare play that features Harry Hotspur and his family, Henry IV, Part 1.
We had a great time learning more about the characters, themes and plots of the play, and we hope you enjoy it too.
We're very happy to be joined once again by Shakespeare expert and academic and now returning guest on the Alnwick Castle Podcast, Ronan Paterson. How are you, Ronan?
Hello there, Daniel. Lovely to be back.
You very kindly returned to the podcast to tell us all about Henry IV, Part 1. It's one of our favourite Shakespeare plays for obvious reasons, Harry Hotspur being a main character in it. But before we get to him and some of those other characters, could you tell us a bit of the background of the play and what the story of Henry IV is?
Yes. Well, Henry IV, Part 1, actually, is one of my favourite Shakespeare's as well, because I think it's a play that's got everything. It's got the clash of armies, it's got great men and the fall of princes and all of that. It's also got Falstaff, who I think is probably the best character Shakespeare ever wrote. But the play it's extraordinary. It's part of a trilogy. It's the first part of a trilogy. When Shakespeare wrote about kings, the kings he'd written about before, if they were called Henry, they got 3 plays. If they're called Richard, they only got 1 each. But he had done a trilogy before, 3 plays about Henry VI, who is the son of the king that this trilogy deals with. And the trilogy is Henry IV, Part 1, Henry IV, Part 2, and Henry V. Now, this play, when Shakespeare wrote the Henry VI plays, he was at the beginning of his career, and they are much more uneven, they're much less assured. But when he came to write Henry IV, Part 1, he was really into his stride as a mature playwright. And his structuring, his drawing of characters, everything, the writing of the dialogue and the speeches, all of that is much more assured than it was in those earlier plays. It's also, in many ways, a Freudian's delight. I mean, we think of Hamlet as being the Freudian play, perhaps the Oedipal themes of it, and that's certainly how Olivier filmed it. But actually, Henry IV, Part 1 is on a much deeper level Oedipal in that sense. It's about 2 sons and 2 fathers. Now, Prince Hal, who is the protagonist of this trilogy, begins as a dissolute youth, and he is contrasted unfavorably with Hotspur, who is held up as the embodiment of knightly virtues. He's heroic, he's brave, he's all of those things, and yet on the other hand, Prince Hal is spending his time in sleazy inns with degenerate people, crooks, robbers, etc., and is being held up as an example of licentiousness in the same way that Hotspur is being held up as an example of medieval virtues. But Hal has 2 fathers as well. He has his real father, who is King Henry IV, and he has his surrogate father, who is Sir John Falstaff. His real father is rather cold and aloof and always very damning in his dealings with him, whereas Sir John Falstaff is, in many ways, introducing him to another set of qualities which are seen in a completely negative light. But what happens is that as we go through the 3 plays, those qualities mix with Hal gradually learning the virtues of Hotspur. And that turns him in the end from this dissolute youth into, by Henry V, the perfect warrior king of England, the most famous warrior king, the one who won England's most magnificent victory at Azincourt.
So you mentioned Falstaff. He's one
Yeah.
of obviously Shakespeare's most popular characters, and you said your favourite. So what do you like about him as a character?
Falstaff is the most wonderful, life-affirming, totally dissolute, funny but warm-hearted, wicked but hilarious. He's a character of such contrasts. He's described as a huge hill of flesh. He's a coward, he's a thief, he's a liar. He lies all the time, not with even the slightest ability to convince other people. But I don't know if you ever read the Just William books when you were growing up, but in that, William is described by the author. She says, there are two sorts of lying. One is the ability to lie so as to convince others, and the other is the ability to lie so as to convince yourself. William was possessed only of the latter of these two abilities. And the same is true of Falstaff. His lies are so outrageous, but they're wonderful. He's funny, but he's also got this terrible tragic undercurrent which comes out at the end of the second play. I think he's the most fully rounded of all of Shakespeare's characters. I think, you see, that Henry IV Part 1 is a play that could work on its own. I think Shakespeare wrote a play called Henry IV, and that play could stand on its own and have in it the redemption of Hal. But Falstaff was so hugely popular, and there were bits of the story that weren't quite tied up. So he was able to create a Part 2 in exactly the same way that Hollywood does now with sequels to things. And if you look at the way Part 2 is structured, although it has further ramifications of Hal and his father, it's really the story of Falstaff, and it's the story arc of Falstaff which really is the climax of the play. But Falstaff has captivated people in all cultures. The first Shakespeare play to be adapted in Japan for the Japanese theatre was based on Falstaff. It was called The Boastful Samurai. And Falstaff, there was in Roman comedy a character who had some of Falstaff's traits. Roman comedy worked with stock characters, and one of them was called the Miles Gloriosus, which means the soldier. Basically, he was a boastful soldier. And Falstaff has that, but he's got so much more besides, because the Miles Gloriosus wasn't necessarily a pickpocket and a thief. Although he lied about his own exploits, he didn't necessarily lie just for the fun of it in the way that Falstaff does. Falstaff also has some traits from the medieval mystery plays. Often in medieval mystery plays, there would be two characters. There'd be the good angel and the bad angel, which is like virtue and vice. And Falstaff is in the tradition of the medieval vice, who was always the most popular character in the medieval plays as well. They always used to say the devil has the best tunes. The devil usually has the best lines as well, and certainly Falstaff does. Yeah.
So that's Hal's surrogate father.
Yeah.
But what about his real father, Henry IV, the king? How does he stack up as a Shakespearean king?
Well, he's not actually considered to be a great part in the way that the others are, but I think that's wrong, and I think it's very short-sighted. I mean, actually, Henry IV has got his own trilogy, but it's different from his sons, because Henry IV's trilogy is actually Richard II when he is Bolingbroke and he usurps the throne, and then the two plays of Henry IV where he deals with that and his guilt at being a usurper, because, of course, the idea of usurpation was absolutely the worst crime that could be committed, in Shakespeare's time, and certainly thereafter. I mean, in the time of King James, James actually enshrined this doctrine of the divine right of kings. Kings were supposed to be divinely appointed by God, and anyone who overthrows the Lord's anointed is damned forever to hell and damnation. Well, Henry is conscious of that guilt throughout, and what he is trying to do, one of the reasons he's so frustrated with his son, who we tend to call Hal, as the younger Henry. One of the reasons he's so frustrated is because for him it's an important part of his claim to legitimacy that he's showing virtue in his house, in the house of Plantagenet, virtue in that house. And actually, when he calls in Hal and he gives him the parental rollicking, he is saying, look, when I came to this country to claim my own, Richard was the one who was behaving dissolutely, and everyone was looking at him, and they acclaimed me the more. And that is why, although I came back just to get my dukedom back, actually the popular acclaim wanted me to be king because I showed virtue as opposed to Richard's vices. But now you, Hal, are showing the same vices that Richard showed, and people will say the same thing, and you will be usurped by somebody else because you are so dissolute.
That's some of Hal's characteristics, but how does he compare to the character of Hotspur in the play?
Well, yeah, Hotspur is brave, Hotspur is charismatic, Hotspur is successful militarily. I mean, the play says he's never been defeated, although, of course, actually we know he was. And the father of the Earl of Douglas in this play defeated him twice, once outside Newcastle, where he swiped Hotspur's banner and planted it in front of his tent and said, come and get it. And the second time at Otterburn, although he was killed, he won the battle and Hotspur was captured. But in Shakespeare's play, it says he's never been defeated. And the king in the first act is talking to Sir Walter Blunt and others and saying, oh, would some night-tripping fairy had switched the babies, and he had my Harry and I his. And if only I had a son who was that brave, that courageous, that virtuous. He's the example to all the youth of England. The actual phrases about him being the example to the youth of England come in part 2. And when I was here before, Daniel and I had that conversation about Hotspur and how he spoke, but people imitated the way he spoke. Henry is saying, look at that. If I had his son, I'd be completely happy. And he could have my son. It doesn't matter. He's just the Earl of Northumberland. You know?
Hotspur is an important character in the play. He actually appears in the subtitle of it. So he's not the only Percy, though. There are other Percys that turn up. Could you tell us about some of them?
Yes. Well, there are 2 other Percys who are important to the political plot, if you like. And then, of course, there's his wife. Now, to start with the political characters, because we meet them first in the play. There is his uncle, who is the Earl of Worcester, and his father, who is the Earl of Northumberland. Now, Worcester is very much the conniving figure in this. Worcester is the one who has all sorts of resentments bubbling away, and he is the one who engineers, in many ways, this rebellion. Now, Hotspur doesn't need a lot of prompting. Hotspur gets all the provocation he needs in the scene with Henry after a while. But his father, the thing is, they have history. If you go back to Richard II, the Percys were the ones that first supported Henry. When Henry hadn't a backside to put in his trousers, really, he'd just got off the ship at Ravenspur and nobody wanted to know about him. The Percys came and they supported him, and they were so influential that a lot of other nobles then came, rallied to Henry's cause. The Percys were right at the core of that movement to support Henry against Richard II. Now, at that time, as the Earl of Northumberland tells us, he says, you said you were only coming to get your own birthright, and I was happy to support that. You said you had no ambitions to the crown, but actually you broke your word. And now that changes everything. All bets are off. We had an agreement, and you have broken it. And Henry is very annoyed by this. But Henry is basically trying to say, well, the people wanted me to become king, and look at the state of Richard. Richard was kind of the Liz Truss of the dynasty. Look at the state of that. People said, you must take over. So I did, but now what's happened is the immediate trigger for the anger that the Percy family feel towards Henry is because Edmund Mortimer has been captured, their relative, has been captured by the Welsh. He was sent to deal with the troublesome Welsh. There's this guy, Owen Glendower, who has been having considerable success in the Welsh marches against Henry. And Mortimer was sent to supposedly deal with him and has ended up getting captured instead. And not only has he got captured, but he has actually married the daughter. Now, that infuriated Henry. He's refusing to ransom him. And the Percys are saying, what do you mean you refuse to ransom him? You have to ransom him. The immediate trigger for the row is because Hotspur has captured some Scots, and he is refusing to give them to the king because nobles were generally not killed in battles, right? If you were a noble, one, you had a suit of armor, which was pretty resistant to most of the weapons at the time. Two, if you said, all right, I yield, you would get a nice cushy berth in your captor's castle, and you would wait for your family to ransom you. And this was a significant part of the income of warrior noblemen. Oh yes, we'll go to war because we'll capture some other nobles. Killing peasants didn't even count. You probably didn't even waste your time with that. You went around looking for another noble to have a fight with, get him to yield, and then you would get the ransom. Anyway, Percy has captured some Scots, including Douglas, and instead of handing them over to the king so he can ransom them and he can get the money, Percy is saying, I'm not going to give you these until you ransom Mortimer. Well, the rock and the hard place meet in that moment. And there we see how angry Henry is, but also how immediately volcanically angry Hotspur becomes. And the Percys, including Worcester and Northumberland, get very angry at the slight towards their family. And Worcester is the one who really knows how to rub salt in the wound. He really gets the niggle in there to make sure that Northumberland and Hotspur are ready for action. They have a conspiracy which has been going on for a while, which also involves the Archbishop of York. Now, the Archbishop of York is more driven by a feeling for Richard II and the impropriety of the usurpation. But anyway, they've got some pretty powerful forces on their side, because if they have Mortimer, Glendower, the Archbishop of York, and the Percys, that's actually quite a confederation, because, of course, the Percys had the biggest standing army in the country. I mean, there weren't actually standing armies, really, apart from Percy's forces, which were a standing army because they had to defend the border against the Scots. So Percy had the largest body of armed men permanently in the field. He was always demanding more money to pay them. It was a very expensive thing to keep armies in the field. But Percy had that large army. Glendower had an army he'd raised. The Archbishop of York could raise an army, and so on and so on.
Can you tell us a little bit about Harry Hotspur's wife, who was called Kate in this play?
Well, first of all, her name wasn't Kate in reality. But the scene between Hotspur and Kate is a very difficult scene for actors, because what happens is she comes in and she says, what's the matter with you? Why can't you sleep? Why are you, kicking and struggling and talking in your sleep about cannons and sieges and things like that? will you tell me what's going on? He goes, oh, you don't need to worry about it. And she said, look, if you love me, you would tell me. Does that mean you don't love me? And when you have only that bit between them, how do you flesh out an entire relationship? Because when we see her in part 2, because of course he's dead at the end of part 1, she was really in love with him and she's mourning him, heartbroken. So the lines seem to be at odds with the sentiment that appears to be there in the scene. And it's all about, come, come, you parakeeto. In other words, you're just talking nonsense. Or if you don't tell me, I'll break your little finger. And he's being incredibly patronizing. Now, he's either a complete idiot and utterly sexist, or it's some kind of game. Now, I don't know. I've seen it done both ways. Well, in fact, a number of ways. I've seen it done where actually their marriage is a complete lie and bitter and twisted, which many aristocratic marriages were, because you didn't marry for love. But actually, he has got that scene in Glendower's castle where they do seem more affectionate. So, given that in the scene in Glendower's castle and the scene in part 2, there is affection between them, then that scene in the boudoir is not a true reflection, or the lines in it are not a true reflection of the feelings they have for each other. So maybe it is a game, and maybe it is some kind of play between them. It's interesting because when he has characters called Kate, they're usually quite feisty. I don't know who he knew called Kate that was that feisty, but that seems to be a trait that Kates have, just like Henry's get trilogies and Richard's get single plays.
Her real name was Elizabeth.
Yes.
Would that have been changed for royal
Political
reasons?
Yeah. I mean, it could have been. Maybe he just didn't know. I mean, she was actually from Herefordshire, wasn't she? I mean, it's interesting. When I directed the play, she had a Northumbrian accent, but actually she should probably have had a Herefordshire accent and talked to, come, come, you parakeeto, what keeps my Harry from my bed? Be that as it may, she is a character with considerable spirit, I would say. She knew who she was marrying. He's always going off to war. I mean, he spends more time in the saddle than he does in an armchair, that's for sure. And that's when he's happiest. He loves going out and clobbering Scots and coming back and, wiping his blood-stained sword on the curtains or whatever and saying, there, what's for dinner? But she's well used to him wanting to fight. So, I think it's a game. Yeah. I think it's a game between them.
She's always struck me as a kind of match for him.
Yeah.
They seem to work well together.
Yes, they do. Yeah, I would say so. I mean, it's sad because she's the one in part 2 who says, speaking thick which nature made his blemish became the accents of the valiant. And she's the one who's saying everybody copied him. She's lost not just her husband, but the person in all of England that the youth looked up to. I mean, she's lost this paragon as well.
You've said that this play can stand by itself, but quite a lot of what you've just talked about links back to Richard II. Do you think audiences at the time especially would have seen these plays as a series? Would they have been able to dip in and out, or would people have seen Richard II and then seen Henry IV in the way that they were put on or performed?
Some of them would have. I mean, some of them would have, but I think Shakespeare was very well aware that a lot of people wouldn't have seen. I do think the plays stand by themselves, and there's a certain amount of backstory given in Henry IV Part 1. Northumberland tells us all that about Richard, just in case they weren't there. But, of course, he did deal with his kings out of chronological order. I mean, he sort of did Henry VI and Richard III before he did Henry IV and Henry V and all of that. But I think that If you went to the theatre to see any part of Henry VI and you only saw one of them, you might feel a bit cheated. I don't know. I mean, not everybody would, but I think generally speaking, that seems to be seen as something you have to see all three parts of, whereas Henry IV Part 1 is often done on its own, although I don't really think Henry IV Part 2 is done so often on its own. It's usually done as a pair or part of a trilogy. You know, you get the RSC or the English Shakespeare Company have done the whole sweep of, have done Richard II and the Henrys. The long Henriad, you would call that, I suppose. But of them all, Henry IV Part 1 is the one that is most often done. Well, Henry V is done on its own, and Henry IV Part 1 is done on its own. Henry IV Part 2 really is a tying up of ends of Henry IV Part 1.
Henry IV Part 1 ends with the death of Hotspur, the Battle of Shrewsbury. How does Shakespeare dramatise this?
Well, yes, this is, well, I mean, it's complete horse feathers. In it there is this, of course, there has to be this clash between the ego and the alter ego, if we're talking about in Freudian terms. Hotspur, of course, was older than Hal's father, and he was killed, as we know, by being shot by an arrow when he lifted up his visor. It didn't happen in historical terms in the way it does in the play, but dramatically it is a very satisfying culmination to see Hal and Hotspur fighting it out. Shakespeare was never one to let history get in the way of good drama, and the good drama is that fight between them. And there's almost a love between them. It's funny when I say that. I mean, when I directed the play many years ago, when Hal kills Hotspur, they collapse together with Hotspur across Hal's lap and in his arms as he died, because he has this speech afterwards in which he's saying, "What a shame, you were such a wonderful person, and it's a shame it had to come to this." But what happens in that moment, really, is in defeating Hotspur. All the way through they talk about it, and he says, "All those honours that are on your head I will take to myself. If I defeat you, all your honours will come to me." And in a way, by defeating him, he is absorbing his good qualities. What he does not absorb from Hotspur is the impulsiveness, the temperamental thing, because actually, if we go right back to the beginning of the play, he's absorbing another set of qualities which are the opposite of Hotspur. When he's in the Boar's Head Tavern, when everyone goes out, he has this speech to the audience talking about the people who have just gone out. And it's a speech that makes him hard to like. He says, "I know you all and will a while uphold the unyoked humour of your idleness. I know I look bad at the moment, but I'm only pretending. And when I throw off this behaviour, I will shine more gloriously because people thought so little of me." Now, you look at that and you can imagine in the Globe, the company sitting there going, "Are you sure, Will? I mean, this makes him a bit of a prig, doesn't it? It makes him pretty dodgy character. It's pretty Machiavellian."
Yeah. There's a kind of class element to it.
There's a class element, yes, absolutely. There's a class element to it. You know, he's making fun of these people. He's pretending. But what is he actually learning from? He's learning what eventually come out as more political skills. He's learning deception at this point in the play. But the qualities that he learns from Falstaff and Bardolph and the others, Pistol and Bardolph and Nym and all of those characters teach him about deception. But as he goes through the journey of the two plays, he gets the better end of that spectrum. He gradually turns into the more virtuous side of those qualities. And it's the combination of the qualities that he learns from the gang in Eastcheap and the qualities he learns on the battlefield of Hotspur that turn him ultimately into Henry V, who can, in spite of the doubts and fears he has on the eve of the battle, inspire his men to the most famous victory in English history up to that point.
A more subjective question now. You've mentioned it's one of your favourite plays.
Yeah.
We like it because of Hotspur and all of the connections it's got to the castle. But have you got any favourite lines, any standout moments that make it one of your favourites?
That's a perfectly fair question, but it may be a longer answer than you intended, because there are actually a number of points. I mean, I think one of my favourite bits dramatically is Falstaff at the Battle of Shrewsbury, where he is kind of blundering around and he gets in a bit of a fight with Douglas, faints, pretends to be dead, then gets up, finds Hotspur's body next to him, stabs him, the dead body, then goes in and claims that he's killed Hotspur, and as proof he says, look, and points to this wound, which he can say with truth, I gave him that wound. The fact that he gave it to him after he was dead is beside the point. I think that works wonderfully well. I think that there are points in the early part. You see, what you've got is you begin with the setting up of this major battle, and then we go down to the rumbustious nature of the gang and the robbery at Gad's Hill and stuff. That's great fun. Poins and Hal break away from the rest of the gang, disguise themselves and come back and rob the robbers, and then let Falstaff come out with this complete fabrication about the battle. I think that, I mean, I played Falstaff many years ago, and that bit about being attacked by men in buckram and the number increasing every sentence is a wonderful piece, particularly because everybody, apart from Falstaff, knows that everybody else knows it's a complete fallacy. I think that's absolutely wonderful. If we were to take the Henriad as a whole, I think the tragic moment at the end of part 2 where Hal turns around and rejects Falstaff, and in Oedipal terms, this is where he kills his other father. His real father is dead by that point. And there were quite poignant moments in that too. But where he kills his surrogate father, I know thee not, old man. I think that's absolutely spine-chilling. I think that's an extraordinary moment. And of course, when you get to the morning of Agincourt, his speech to the troops, the St. Crispin's Day speech, is one of the most rousing speeches ever written by any English dramatist. If you want to see a really good Falstaff and you want to see a really good version of the Battle of Shrewsbury, go and see Orson Welles' Chimes at Midnight. I think I've seen a lot of Falstaffs, and as I say, I played him myself, and I've directed the play separately to that. But for me, Orson Welles was the greatest Falstaff I've ever seen.
Even having probably read it more than a lot of other people, there's still new things to find.
Oh, indeed, indeed. At the beginning, Henry's saying, he's going, all right, now what's happened? We've had this terrible civil war. Now it's over. So now what are we going to do? We're going to sort out the Middle East, right? And he's doing this whole thing, and suddenly he goes, but this, our purpose is a 12-month-old. And when I did it, he was practicing the speech for what was in effect the equivalent of a political broadcast. And he suddenly stops and goes, look, no one's going to buy this. We've been talking about this for a year. Come up with something better. And then in come the messengers about the battle and Percy and the prisoners. And he's already decided not to put on his breastplate and head for Jerusalem, but he's already demanded that the Percys come for a meeting, and he's already set in motion some of the steps he was going to take. And I hadn't really noticed that before. I hadn't really noticed that he'd already got plans, and it was for something different to what he said at the beginning. So there it was. So you've done me a favour by making me look at it again.
So that seems like a good point to end things on.
All right.
We'll end on a high point.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, so thank you very much for returning to the Alnwick Castle Podcast.
A great pleasure, anytime.
And that was us speaking to Ronan Paterson about William Shakespeare and Henry IV Part 1 and Part 2 and Henry V.
If you've never seen the play before, we definitely recommend doing so next time there's a production near you.
And if you enjoyed this episode of the podcast, please go back through our archive to find last year's Shakespeare-themed episode. We'd love if you could leave us a 5-star rating and review, and if you can recommend us to any theatrical friends or family.
We'll be back with another episode in 2 weeks' time, marking the coronation of King Charles III, with a look back at historical coronations with connections to Alnwick Castle.
Until then, I've been Daniel.
And I've been Deborah.
Thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.
Bye.